So thank you, Andre. So I'm a PhD student of the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and today I will talk to you about the local perception of climate change and how complex it is and why it's important to consider it to understand local adaptation. So first and foremost, some conceptual background to frame a bit this idea of the importance of understanding climate change from local perspective. First, we all know that climate change impact on biophysical systems start to be well known, such as for biodiversity, for example. But the way of how climate change impact indigenous people and local community are less studies. And as we already know, like initiative like IPBS arise some project like ours, like the LICCI project, to study the local perception of climate change. But the holistic understanding and adaptation strategy to climate change involving this cultural aspect by IPLCs still under studies. And it will be my starting point for this reflection. So my objective here is to understand how local perception and adaptation of climate change are related to local belief system in Madagascar. And I will process with these two under objectives. So the objective, like understanding the role of this belief system in the local climate change perception, and to understanding how climate change leads to change in practice, both at the livelihood activities and sociocultural levels. So to do so, I spent several months among Betsileo people, which are an ethnic group from the southern island of Madagascar. They are mainly agropastoralism. They do agropastoralism, and they rely on mainly on rice cultivation and zebu breeding. As many other Malagasy ethnic groups, they follow the Radzanism, which is the cult of the ancestor, and the Fadi system. It's a system of taboo, a system of prohibition, owned by spiritual entities to regulate social rules and manage natural resources. So the method that I use, it's quite the same as Andre already showed you. Like it's a bunch of semi-structured interview on change and adaptation about climate change and the drivers. But I also use another set of interview with traditional diviners, like key informant, about their belief system and how they relate it to climatic system. So my results there, as a result, we have like 151 observations of change related to climate change. 70% of them are considered as harmful to their main livelihood activities, which is rice production. We also found like 6 species involved as a bioindicator of seasonality, and 7 others threatened by climate change. As you can see here, it's this table just shows some data collected through this interview and show a big shift in seasonality, which these 2 decades, which influence a lot the livelihood activities. So what Betsileo reported mainly, it's concerned the seasonal shift, the late rain, and the growing unpredictability of weather, which has a considerable impact on rice production. So as you can see, they have a pretty accurate understanding of the bioclimatic system. But not only, actually, they also understand the climate change under the prism of their belief system. So as we just see before, they follow the Radzanism, this cult of ancestor. So in their cosmogony, they understand under 2 main world of spiritual entities who enforce their own rules. The human one with the ancestors, and the non-human one with malicious ghosts. But the interesting things to understand is both of these spiritual entities enforcing their own rules, and if you not comply to these rules, there is some consequences. But more interestingly, and consequences dependent of the nature of these spiritual entities. So interestingly, if it's about malicious ghosts, the consequences are more related to natural words, so like climatic disturbance, hail, or lightning. I think it's an interesting point to understand their mindset and how they perceive it. But a question remains is how they connected that with their perception of climate change. So based on this data, I build a biocultural network to try to situate a bit where climate change interferes. So climate change is deeply embedded in this biocultural network first, but it's also the consequences of both bioclimatic and also magical religious process. So as you can see, they distinguish several drivers in the gray shape. You have like the taboo system regulated by spirit and ancestor, population increases, and deforestation. These three drivers have a huge impact on climate change, which already have an impact on the citizens' livelihood. And another question is, how do they adapt to this complex, to this climate change with these two understanding, magical religious and bioclimatic? So of course there is some technical adaptation, like for example to cope with food risk. It could be like the abandon of traditional rice varieties, culturally important, for new varieties of rice, for example, will grow in less time, fitting better with the new eco windows of crop growing, I mean the new season. But it also could be the abandon of traditional livelihood for new jobs like touristic guide and so on. But there is another thing, there is also a magical religious adaptation. So usually the role of ancestors in their beliefs is to give support in during food crisis or bad weather for crops. So what they use, usually they do some requests to their ancestors through two ways: traditional diviners through these services and through offering. But which is interesting here, it's like Betsileo people know that ancestors have a limited influence compared to the malicious ghost. But they do not have a direct link with this malicious ghost, or I mean, from both sides, human or ancestor. So what they do first, they increase the number of requests to their ancestor to help them, or they use some techniques to increase the power. But more interestingly, they use another way. They start using some prohibited ritual from other ethnic groups like Antemoro, and so they use Antemoro black magic to shunt their own system to contact directly malicious ghosts and maybe have an influence to balance a bit the weather. But this practice is really interesting because it's extremely taboo. So it's like leaving this own religion to another, which I think is interesting because these new cultural behaviors bring an important cultural dilemma. So what's the implication of this thing? So, for example, the main result, if we understand well, climate change is perceived both as a result of bioclimatic process and the response of spiritual entities to rules non-compliance. But consequently, adaptation strategy follows the same scheme with technical and magical religious response. So the main implication is that local understanding involves several diverse aspects, usually organized in complex biocultural network, justifying the need of for an holistic approach. Second, climate change is not only a profound impact on local livelihood, but also on social cultural structures and well-being by creating this important cultural dilemma. Consequently, some adaptation strategy, which we saw like to be turned to another culture or other way to cope with this situation, might threaten traditional knowledge too. And they asked me also this question on the field: do traditions are obsolete to cope with global change? Which raises this open question: do climate change lead to cultural changes? So now I just have to thank you for listening and pass the word to another participant. Thank you.